The chamber is open and full of whispers.
The marble was cold under his palm. Harry didn't know why he'd reached out, only that his hand had moved before he could stop it, drawn to the Gringotts counter the way a compass needle finds north, not by decision, but by principle. Something in him that did not have a name yet, pulling toward something that had been waiting a very long time. The marble was worn smooth by 10,000 transactions, and the instant his fingers made contact, something deep inside his chest opened. Like a door swinging inward in a house he hadn't known he lived in. Hagrid was still talking. Something about the Potter key. Harry barely heard it. The goblin behind the counter had gone still, not the crisp mechanical stillness of a clerk processing arithmetic. This was different. The goblin's amber eyes had moved from Hagrid's enormous beard to Harry's hand on the marble, and something in those eyes had changed entirely. The professional calculation dropped away and left something older and more careful in its place. His ears flattened. The quill he'd been holding was set down with precise deliberateness. "Griplock," he said, in gobbledygook. The tone needed no translation. "Come here. Right now." Harry lifted his hand. The cold sensation left his palm slowly, like something reluctant to let go. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to. Do not apologize." The goblin who appeared from behind the brass corridor door was broad-shouldered and old in the specific way that ancient institutions produce. Not frail, but dense. 700 years of human foolishness compressed into a small frame that had stopped being surprised by any of it. He looked at Harry's hand. Then, at Harry's forehead. Then, very precisely, at the air approximately 3 inches above Harry's scar. "You will come with me," Hagrid sputtered. "Now, see here, the half-giant may wait." Griplock's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had never, in living institutional memory, been told no, and not eventually been proven correct. "The boy comes now." On the far side of the Gringotts main hall, at counter 37, a different conversation had just stopped entirely. Hermione Granger had come to Gringotts with her parents to open a wizarding trust account, a standard recommendation from the Hogwarts enrollment liaison, who had visited the Granger dental practice in June. The intake process was supposed to be simple. A small vault, a key. Form 14B. The goblin at counter 37 had asked, as standard procedure for new accounts with Muggle parentage, whether she would consent to a heritage classification scan, useful for tax filing purposes. She'd said yes immediately, because she said yes to all information-gathering procedures. The parchment ignited, not in fire, in light. A cold blue-silver radiance erupted from the center of the page, and bled outward in letters that appeared without ink, in a script that predated the modern wizarding alphabet by 6 centuries. Hermione's first instinct was to read it. Her second instinct, arriving approximately 1 second later, was to recognize that she could read it, which should have been impossible given that she'd never studied Proto-Runic and had owned magical theory for exactly 4 days. The letters weren't static. They moved with the quality of text assembling itself from something that had always been there, words rising through the parchment the way heat rises from stone in summer, as though the message had been embedded for 9 centuries and was only now being given permission to surface. Hermione read each word as it formed, and felt something in her memory reshuffle, the way a sentence becomes clear when the final word arrives. She understood the script. She was realizing, understood this script in some deep part of herself that did not depend on study. "Rowena," the letter said, in the old tongue. "Her blood returns." Her mother said, "Hermione, what does it?" But the goblin at counter 37 had already pressed a small brass bell 3 times. By the time Hermione's mother had finished asking what it meant, 4 senior Gringotts officials had come through the brass doors. And all 4 were looking at Hermione with the particular expression of people who had rehearsed for this moment in every generation for 900 years, without genuinely expecting it to arrive on a Wednesday morning in August. They brought Harry and Hermione to the same room. It was deep below the main hall, below the vaults, below the lower tunnels. Carved from bedrock so ancient it predated the Goblin rebellions by several centuries. The walls were covered in runes that functioned not as decoration, but as ongoing record, a written memory of every transaction, every oath, every bloodline that had passed through this bank since its founding. A stone table occupied the room's center. On the table, 2 parchments, 2 silver needles, 2 signet rings, and 2 grimoires sealed with clasps that were neither metal nor bone. Harry looked at the girl across the table. She was his age, dark-haired, with sharp brown eyes that had already catalogued the room. Both parchments, the rune work on the walls, and the composition of the table's stone in the 30 seconds since she'd arrived. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who had 17 questions and was sorting them by priority. "You're Harry Potter," she said. "Yes. I'm Hermione Granger." She glanced at the parchment in front of her. "Do you know what this is?" "No. Do you?" "The runes on the walls are proto-runic, with Founder-era modifications. I've been reading the supplementary parchment." She indicated a third document on the table Harry hadn't noticed, dense small print, which she'd apparently been absorbing while he was still processing the room. "If the test says what I think it says, we have a very narrow window in which to make some significant decisions." Harry looked at Griplock, who had arranged himself at the head of the table with the bearing of a man presiding over something he'd waited his entire career for. "Can someone explain what's happening?" "Put your hand on the parchment," Griplock said. "Both of you. Then it will explain itself." They placed their palms down simultaneously. Harry's parchment wrote itself in crimson and gold. The Gryffindor bloodline traced backward from Harry through 14 generations of scattered, diluted, and largely forgotten descendants, through the Potter family where it had lain dormant for 3 generations, back and back through the centuries to the man whose name the line carried. Hermione's parchment wrote itself in silver and blue. The Ravenclaw line through the Dagworth Granger squib branch, 6 generations removed from the main house, the magical gene suppressed but present, preserved in the bloodline like a word remembered in a forgotten language. Harry read his parchment, read it again, looked up. Every goblin in the room had knelt, not bowed, knelt, both knees on the stone floor, foreheads inclined, in the full formal acknowledgement reserved in goblin culture for sovereign holders of pre-ministry magical authority. There were 14 goblins in the chamber. Every one of them was on the floor. Harry opened his mouth. "Don't tell them they don't have to," Hermione said quietly. "The protocol is specific. You accept the acknowledgement, or you disclaim the inheritance. Accepting doesn't obligate you to anything except not denying the bloodline." He looked at her. "How do you, Parchment 3? "I've been reading." She held his gaze steadily, and something in her expression said, "I am also processing a great deal of information right now, and I would appreciate it if we could get through the ritual before we have the feelings." "Right," Harry said. He looked at the kneeling goblins. "I accept." Hermione said, "Accepted." The rings were warm when they put them on, not from the room's ambient temperature, but from something internal, as if they'd been waiting a long time in the cold, and were now remembering what it felt like to be worn. Harry's ring settled onto his finger with a weight that exceeded its physical dimensions, like a stone fitted into a wall that has been waiting exactly that shape of gap for 1,000 years. He felt his own magic adjust around it, not changing, not diminishing, but aligning, the way a compass settles when it finds north. His hand felt different, not heavier, more certain. The lion rampant on flat gold caught the torchlight with a low, satisfied gleam, and in Harry's blood something answered it, a deep structural recognition that had nothing to do with thought, and everything to do with what he had always, at some cellular level, already been. Hermione's eagle was delicacy itself. The individual feathers worked in silver detail so fine they seemed to shift with her pulse. She looked at it for 3 seconds in the specific way she looked at things she was committing to permanent memory, and then looked up at the rune walls, and Harry saw in her face the exact moment the Ravenclaw resonance engaged. A sharpening. Like a lens clicking into focus, the wall's proto-runic inscription suddenly legible to her in a way that went beyond translation. "Oh," she said quietly. It was not an exclamation. It was an intake of breath at the scope of something. The moment both rings seated, the grimoires on the table unlocked themselves and fell open, and the runes on the chamber walls lit in sequence, gold, then silver. Then both at once, and deep below them, In the bank's lowest subterranean archive, two sealed vault doors opened for the first time in 900 years. The castle had been expecting them. That was Harry's first impression when they arrived, that the ancient building already knew. The front doors opened before they reached them, swinging inward on hinges that hadn't moved in months. And the entrance hall beyond was lit not by torchlight but by something warmer, the walls themselves giving off a low amber radiance that tracked them as they walked. Portraits stirred in their frames, faces leaning forward. The staircases settled as they passed, refusing to spiral to alternate configurations, cooperating, for the first time, simply because they were asked. Hagrid had escorted them here after 2 days of preparation, confused but good-natured about the whole affair. Hermione's parents had needed a full evening of reassurance before releasing their daughter into the care of an 11-year-old boy, a 9-foot groundskeeper, and the implications of 9-century-old magical inheritance law. They'd managed it with characteristic Granger pragmatism. They had questions. Harry and Hermione answered them completely and without condescension. And the Grangers concluded that their daughter was in the company of someone who would not make bad decisions carelessly. The castle took them directly to the Founder's suite, without being asked. It was in the East Wing, behind a wall that had spent 900 years looking like solid stone. The wall opened when Harry pressed his ring to it. Behind it was a corridor unlike the rest of Hogwarts, broader, quieter, with higher ceilings and the particular quality of air found in places that have not been disturbed for a very long time. The suite itself occupied the entire top floor of the wing, 2 studies, 2 bedrooms, a shared workroom with a hearth large enough to heat a small house, a library with shelves that were not empty, and a balcony that faced the lake and the mountains beyond it. Every surface in the rooms had been waiting. The beds were made, the fires were lit. The library's shelves held the Founder's grimoires, 12 volumes in total, 6 per bloodline, and beside them, copies of every key text in every Hogwarts subject written in the original hand of the instructors who first devised them, annotated in the cramped, brilliant marginalia of Rowena Ravenclaw and the bold, sometimes chaotic glosses of Godric Gryffindor, who had apparently felt very strongly about a number of things. Hermione went directly to the library. Harry went to the balcony and stood in the late afternoon light and tried to understand that this was real. He didn't succeed, but he tried. He came back inside as the light went flat amber, and Hermione had already arranged 4 grimoire volumes on the reading table and was working through the second without looking up. She held up one finger. "I have found something and need 30 more seconds." He sat down and opened the first Gryffindor grimoire at random. It fell to a page in Godric's own hand, bold, slightly impatient, as though the man had been writing faster than the quill wanted to move. At the top, "If the bloodline ever comes back, they will need to know this first. Not the magic. Not the history." This, what followed, was a paragraph Harry read 3 times. The Gryffindor gift is not courage. Courage is a choice, available to anyone. What the bloodline carries is different, the ability to hold fire without burning, to contain the full weight of what magic asks of a person, and remain the person who was there before magic asked. "What did you find?" he said. "Rowena's working notes on detection methodology for hostile soul fragments embedded in a living host," Hermione said, without looking up. She theorized the entire mechanism 3 centuries before Horcrux creation was formally documented. She was extremely upset about it. She turned a page. "Also, you have one." "I know," Harry said. He'd felt it all afternoon, the second pulse, the wrong temperature under the scar. "The grimoire has a protocol?" "Day 4 is the critical juncture," Hermione said, looking up at him now. Her expression was composed, which meant she had thought through the frightening parts and arrived at the actionable ones. "It won't be comfortable. But it will work. It's not a cure. It's a correction." She closed the grimoire. "We should sleep." The Horcrux announced itself on the second night. Harry was asleep when it started, a fever that climbed fast, dragging him out of sleep and into something that wasn't quite either state. His scar burned. Not the sharp lightning flash he'd felt occasionally before. This was a sustained pressure, deep and expanding, as if something inside the bone of his forehead was trying to push outward. When he pressed his palm to it, he could feel his own pulse in the scar with unusual clarity, and behind it, faint but unmistakable, something else. A second pulse. Wrong rhythm. Wrong temperature. The Gryffindor fire found it within the hour. It had been building since Gringotts, low and instinctive in his blood, and now it recognized the foreign thing with the specific hostility of a body confronting infection. Harry's temperature spiked. He gripped the bed frame and did not call out, because the grimoire he'd spent 6 hours reading that afternoon had described this process in clinical detail and told him exactly what to expect, and knowing what to expect was the only thing that kept it manageable. Hermione appeared in the doorway at approximately 3 a.m. Holding a diagnostic parchment and looking like someone who had already cross-referenced the grimoire's description of foundational purge syndrome against 4 other sources and reached a confident conclusion. "I know," Harry said, through the fever. "I've read about it." "Day 4 is the worst," she said. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed without asking, and opened her own grimoire. "I'll stay up with you." He didn't argue. He wasn't sure he could have, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. It was in fact day 4 that broke something loose. The fever peaked in the early hours before dawn, not as heat, exactly, but as clarity of the wrong kind, the way extreme cold can feel like burning. Harry lay flat on the stone floor of his room, because the floor was cooler than the bed and the grimoire had mentioned that grounding contact helped. And he breathed in the measured pattern Hermione had taught him from a Ravenclaw meditation protocol, and let the fire do what it was doing. What it was doing was hunting. He could feel it the way you feel your own heartbeat when you put your ear to a pillow, not from outside but from within, the Gryffindor resonance moving through him like a current following a river's old channels, mapping the foreign architecture of the thing in his scar, with the patient precision of something that has been designed for exactly this. It did not hurry. It identified. It traced the fragment's edges with the meticulous attention of a craftsman finding the seam in a piece of work that does not belong in the piece. He saw it, not a full vision but a fragment, the way a word surfaces in a dream and is already fading by the time you reach for it. A mind that was not his, vast and cold and furious, registering the purging fire and understanding exactly what it meant. A will that had spent a decade in scattered pieces suddenly focusing all its attention on the small burning point of Harry's scar. The thing felt him looking. For one terrible second they were aware of each other, the cold intelligence in the scar and the 11-year-old boy on the stone floor, and what Harry felt from the other side was not malice. Exactly. But something older and more absolute, the complete refusal of any existence but its own. The specific quality of a thing that has made itself so certain of its own primacy that every other person is simply a condition to be managed. He understood, in that second, why it was so dangerous. Not because it was powerful. Because it genuinely believed it was the only thing that mattered. The fire burned hotter. The cold thing retreated. Harry kept his breath even and his eyes open and his hand flat on the stone floor, and when the fire found the final edge of the fragment, and the burn went from deep to total, he made no sound. The grimoire had said this was important, not the silence itself, but what the silence meant, that the process was happening to the Horcrux, not to him. That distinction was everything. By the morning of day 5, Harry's scar had cooled completely for the first time in his conscious memory. He pressed 2 fingers to it and felt nothing but his own skin, his own pulse, no second rhythm underneath. He sat up. Outside the suite's windows, the lake was gold and silver in the early light, perfectly still, catching the first sunrise of August without interference. "It's gone," he said. Hermione looked up from her notes. She had been documenting the process with methodical thoroughness, and would later file a 14-page analysis in the Ravenclaw Grimoire's appendix under the heading Incidental Horcrux Resolution via Foundational Counterpolarity, a case study. "I know," she said. "Your core resonance changed at 4:17 a.m. I measured it." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Can you feel yours?" She considered the question seriously. "Not yet, but the diadem circlet is getting warmer. I think something is starting." She glanced at the circlet on its stand by the window, where it sat in the morning light with unremarkable silver patience. The grimoire says it's different for the Ravenclaw line. Less fire, more clarification. Clarification of what? Everything, she said simply. She returned to her notes. Harry watched the lake for a while. The summer light shifted across the water. Something in his chest, that door that had opened at Gringotts and never properly closed, settled into a new configuration. Not open anymore. Just wider than before. He reached for his grimoire. There was a great deal more to learn. On the 14th day of August, a formal letter arrived addressed to Professor Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. It was written on Founder's Charter parchment, cream white and bearing both signet seals, in Hermione's precise hand, with Harry's signature beneath hers. Dear Professor Dumbledore, we are writing to inform you of our current residency in the Founder's Suite, which we have occupied since August 3rd, under the terms of the Emergency Succession Clause of the Founder's Charter. We anticipate remaining through the full academic year and all subsequent years of our enrollment. We wish to extend every professional courtesy to you in your role as headmaster. Please feel welcome to continue your administrative duties as normal. We have reviewed the Hogwarts Charter's staffing provisions and do not anticipate immediate changes to the faculty roster at this time, though we reserve all rights to that effect, as outlined in Section 7. Paragraph 3 of the Founders' Regency Protocols. We look forward to beginning the term. In the meantime, we would appreciate the return of the Philosopher's Stone to its proper owner at the earliest opportunity. We are aware of its current location. We mention this only to indicate that the existing security arrangements, while imaginative, are insufficient, and we will be establishing supplementary foundational wards around the third-floor corridor at our earliest convenience. Yours in institutional partnership, Harry J. Potter, Lord Gryffindor Hermione J. Granger, Lady Ravenclaw Dumbledore read the letter twice. He set it down. He looked out his office window at the castle, at the eastern wing, where a light burned that had not burned in 9 centuries. He sat very still for a long time. Then he reached for a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote back, I believe we should meet. The students arrived by boat and by instinct, the way first years always did, in clusters of nervous energy and wide eyes, clutching robes that smelled of trunk storage and summer and home. They filed into the entrance hall and looked up at the enchanted ceiling and gasped at the candles, and then arranged themselves in a shuffling, whispering mass near the great doors, and waited for Professor McGonagall to explain what was going to happen to them. She was halfway through her explanation when the great hall went quiet. Harry and Hermione came down the marble staircase from the upper corridor, and they were not in school robes. Harry wore deep red silk with gold trim. The Gryffindor lion worked across the breast in thread that caught the candlelight and seemed to move independently of the fabric. Hermione wore midnight blue with silver. The Ravenclaw eagle embroidered in detail fine enough to see the individual feathers. Both wore their signet rings. Both carried their grimoires closed under one arm, the clasps sealed. They moved with the particular unhurried quality of people who had arrived exactly when they intended to, and the 100 first years parted for them without being asked. The way water parts for something that moves through it with complete confidence in its own displacement. McGonagall stared. Harry met her eyes. Professor, he said pleasantly. Shall we go in? McGonagall, to her enormous credit, recovered in approximately 3 seconds. She said, yes, and led them through the doors. The great hall noticed. The older students leaned to whisper, then stared openly, then fell quiet in overlapping ripples. The teachers at the high table watched the doors. Dumbledore watched Harry. His expression was precisely calibrated, welcoming, warm, professionally composed, but his eyes were doing calculations. The sorting proceeded normally through the first 30 names. Students called, students sorted, the hat making its pronouncements to varying degrees of applause. Harry and Hermione stood at the front of the first-year group and waited with no visible impatience. Then Professor McGonagall called, Granger, Hermione. Hermione walked to the stool, sat, accepted the hat's placement on her head. The hat was silent for 7 seconds, an unusually long time, and then said, clearly and without any of its normal theatrical hesitation, there is a Ravenclaw here. Yes, but not a student. The hall went completely still. The hat continued. Its ancient voice carried without effort, filling the space between the candles and the enchanted sky. 9 centuries I have sorted witches and wizards into the houses of the founders. Tonight, for the first time in my existence, the founders themselves have returned. Dumbledore rose from his chair. The hat turned its eyeless face toward the hall at large. Hogwarts. Welcome your masters. The hall detonated. Not in chaos, in sound. The older students rose to their feet without coordination, without being asked, pulled upright by something older than school tradition. The enchanted ceiling flared briefly gold and silver, as if the castle itself had inhaled sharply and then exhaled in satisfaction. The candles burned higher. Along the walls, the portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses stood and applauded. Every single one, including the portraits of figures who had historically not agreed with each other about much of anything. At the high table, the faculty reactions were their own kind of record. Flitwick had risen to his feet so quickly his chair scraped backward, and his face held the expression of a man for whom the entire study of charms has just been placed in a new and more magnificent context. Professor Sprout had both hands pressed to her mouth. Quirrell, at the far end, had gone very still in a way that was different from the stillness of the other teachers, not overcome, but recalculating, an intelligence behind his eyes that was running the new information against a set of plans and finding the plans insufficient. McGonagall stood rigid at the sorting podium with the particular quality of rigidity that, in her, meant the strongest possible emotion being contained by the strongest possible professional discipline. And Dumbledore, who had sat back down as the hall erupted, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing not to remain standing, looked at Harry across the room with eyes that were doing something more complex than calculation. Something that might, under different circumstances, have been relief. Hermione removed the hat with composure, set it on the stool, and walked to stand beside Harry. Harry looked up at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back. The headmaster sat down. McGonagall, working from the list, called Potter Harry. Harry walked to the stool. He sat. He accepted the hat. The hat did not deliberate. It spoke at once, and quietly, only to Harry, in the space between the brim and his ear. "You know what you are," it said. "I'm beginning to." Harry thought back. "I was made to sort," the hat said. "I cannot sort a regent. It would be like asking the river to flow uphill. Then don't sort me." "What would you like me to say?" Harry considered for half a second. "Say whatever the castle would say. You're part of it. Ask it." A pause. Then, from the hat, in a voice that was not quite the hat's own, "This one needs no house. This one is all of them, and none of them. This one built the houses." Harry lifted the hat from his head and set it down. He stood, and instead of walking to one of the house tables, he walked to the high table, to the empty space at the center that had, until this moment, been occupied by nothing. A second chair was there. It had not been there an hour ago. The castle apparently had been making its own preparations. Hermione joined him. Harry looked down the high table at the assembled faculty. "Thank you," he said, not loudly, just clearly. "We're glad to be here." He sat. After a moment, Dumbledore waved for the feast to begin. The feast was everything the first years on the benches below had needed it to be: tremendous food, the enchanted ceiling shifting through stars and thin cloud. The older students remembering quickly that nothing they'd witnessed tonight changed the fundamental pleasures of roasted chicken and treacle tart. The noise came back. The school breathed. Harry ate and watched. From the high table he could see all 4 house tables at once, the particular ecology of a school year in its opening moments, the dynamics not yet settled. Friendships forming, and hierarchies negotiated in the subtle language of who sat next to whom, and who passed the pumpkin juice first. A red-haired boy at the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley, who had knocked on the train compartment looking for Neville Longbottom, and stayed 20 minutes when Hermione asked him a question about the Chudley cannons that turned out to be more interesting than anyone expected, was eating with the concentrated happiness of someone for whom a very good meal is a complete experience. Neville Longbottom was talking animatedly to the girl beside him, with the specific relief of a person who has been sorted into the right house and has stopped being afraid for the evening. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy had been watching Harry since the hat's proclamation, with an expression doing several things simultaneously. processing the implications for his own house's social architecture, weighing the new political landscape against what he'd been told at home, and deciding, with the pragmatic survival instinct that made up his most genuinely useful quality, that an immediate opinion was probably premature. McGonagall sat at Harry's right and said nothing for most of the feast. At its end, as the plates cleared themselves, she said quietly, "Without looking at him, you could have been in Gryffindor, you know." The hat was clear on that. "I know," Harry said. "I am Gryffindor." The sorting was always beside the point. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it was." She looked at him with the expression she had been developing since the entrance hall, the one that balanced professional assessment against something older and more personal. "Your mother was one of the finest students I ever taught." "I know," Harry said. "I'd like to hear about her. When you have time." McGonagall nodded once. It was the nod of a woman who has been waiting to be asked, and is glad it has been asked well. Hermione leaned over from Harry's left. She had been in conversation with Flitwick, who had arrived at the high table at the feast's midpoint, and positioned himself in the chair nearest Hermione, with the enthusiasm of a man who has just been handed the most interesting academic situation of his career, and looked quietly, precisely satisfied. "First day of school," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "It went well." He looked out at the hall, at the candlelight and the stars overhead, and the 4 tables of students, and the long windows running gold against the dark outside. The castle moved around them, patient and enormous, and somewhere in the east wing the Founder's suite held its light steady against the night. "Yes," he said. "I think it did." The Board of Governors made the mistake of arriving on a Thursday. Lucius Malfoy led the delegation, 3 members of the board, plus 2 ministry observers, plus 2 personal solicitors retained at considerable expense, and presumably briefed on the situation. They appeared at the main gates in the kind of expensive robes worn specifically to communicate expensive robes, and demanded entrance on grounds of board oversight authority to inspect recent changes to the school's administrative structure. The gates did not open. Lucius Malfoy pointed his wand at them. The gates remained closed. He tried a standard unlocking charm, an advanced unlocking charm, a specialized ward-breaking sequence acquired at significant cost from a source in Eastern Europe. The gates regarded all of this with the architectural indifference of something that had been standing for 900 years and expected to stand for 900 more. Harry appeared on the battlements above them approximately 4 minutes after the gates refused to open. He looked down with polite attentiveness. "Lord Malfoy," he said. "Can I help you?" Lucius looked up. Something moved across his face, the calculation of a man who is prepared for one kind of confrontation and is realizing, belatedly, that the confrontation has a different shape. He recovered quickly. "I am here on behalf of the Board of Governors. We have authority to inspect, you had authority to administer the school in the absence of active Founder's governance," Harry said. "That absence is now resolved. The board's custodial mandate ended on August 1st when the inheritance was claimed." He reached into his robes and produced a sealed document, Founder's Charter parchment, cream white, both signet seals, and dropped it from the battlements. It floated down to the gates with the unhurried dignity of paperwork that has already won. "That's a formal notice of mandate dissolution, filed with Gringotts and copied to the Wizengamot clerks on August 15th. You should have received your copy by owl." Lucius's jaw moved fractionally. "This is unprecedented. It's entirely precedented," Harry said. "It just hasn't come up in 700 years." He leaned on the battlements with the easy confidence of someone standing on their own property. "I've reviewed the board's existing contracts with the school. Your seat was a 3-year term appointment, not hereditary. The appointment ends with the mandate that issued it. You're welcome to apply for the new board we'll be constituting in the spring, under revised terms, without immunity provisions." He paused. "Your ministry observers are welcome to wait at the gates. The ministry doesn't have jurisdiction on the grounds, but they're free to observe from the road." Lucius Malfoy looked at the document. At the gates. At Harry on the battlements. At the ministry observers, who were writing things down with expressions of careful professional neutrality. "This is not the last of this," Lucius said. "No," Harry agreed pleasantly. but it is the last of your authority over this building." He stepped back from the battlements. The delegation stood at the gates for another 20 minutes, Lucius Malfoy staring at the sealed notice with a very specific expression. And then they left. The preemptive rejection of Gilderoy Lockhart was handled with considerably less drama, which is perhaps why it was more satisfying. Hermione had identified the issue in the second week of term, when reviewing the Hogwarts Employment Archive, a set of ledgers stored in the Founder's Suite library, updated by the castle's own record-keeping enchantments, documenting every faculty application, successful or otherwise, back to the school's founding. Gilderoy Lockhart had submitted an application for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position in the summer of 1991 to be considered for the following academic year. His supporting documentation included 12 testimonials from admirers, 8 photographs, 6 copies of his own books, a personal letter in gold ink, and no verified record of a single successfully performed defensive spell. The grimoire's hiring protocols were clear. Faculty must demonstrate genuine competency in their field, not merely claimed competency. Hermione drafted a rejection letter in 40 minutes. Harry signed it. They sent it with the school's official founder's seal, a seal the Hogwarts Owls recognized without instruction, deferring to it over Dumbledore's own administrative correspondence. Lockhart received it on a Tuesday morning, opened it over breakfast, read the line that said Mr. Lockhart's application has been reviewed against the Hogwarts Foundational Competency Standards, and found insufficient on all demonstrated practical criteria, and made a noise his literary agent would later describe as genuinely haunting. He was not invited to reapply. The Malfoy delegation's departure would have been satisfying on its own. But Harry had one final administrative note to dispatch. On the evening of September 5th, he and Hermione sat down with the Hogwarts employment records and the existing faculty roster and conducted a full credential audit. Quirinus Quirrell presented no academic irregularities. His defense qualifications were legitimate, if uninspired, but his aura had been registering against Harry's Gryffindor sensitivity since the welcoming feast with the specific quality of something wearing 2 faces. Harry filed this observation with Hermione, who cross-referenced it with 3 weeks of behavioral notes and produced a 7-point summary of anomalous patterns. They did not act on it yet. They set the file aside, labeled it Quirrell, Monitor, and agreed to let the situation develop while keeping the Philosopher's Stone, now secured behind foundational wards in the 3rd-floor corridor, in a position where anyone approaching it would walk directly into Harry's peripheral awareness. "We're not going to stop him before he moves," Harry said, "but when he moves, we'll be there." Hermione agreed. Then she began composing the structural framework for a revised Hogwarts hiring protocol that would make the Lockhart situation structurally impossible in perpetuity. The school settled around them. The candles burned their ordinary amber in the corridors. Outside, the first autumn rains crossed the mountains toward the lake, and Hogwarts absorbed the coming of the season with the patient contentment of a very old building that had been, for a very long time, waiting for its owners to come home. The corridor was quiet. Harry walked through it without a torch, the ring on his finger casting low ambient light that tracked him without being asked, a function of the foundational wards he'd layered through the 3rd floor over the preceding months. Every stone in this section of the castle knew him by now. The magic in the walls responded to his footsteps the way a sleeping house responds to the footstep of someone familiar, not waking up, just registering, adjusting slightly, settling back. He could feel it ahead, a disturbance in the ward fabric, not a breach, not yet, but pressure. Someone in the corridor between the mirror and the trapdoor. Hermione was 20 steps behind him, already processing. They had known it would be tonight. Quirrell's behavioral patterns had accelerated sharply over the past 2 weeks, increased agitation, longer and more erratic hours, a habit of moving through the castle at night that the portraits had been dutifully reporting. The timing made sense. The Christmas holiday. The castle largely empty. The staff preoccupied with the decorative charm work in the Great Hall. A logical window. Harry had spent the evening reading in the Founder's Suite. Hermione had spent it writing. They'd gone to bed at 10 and set no alarm, and at precisely 2:08 Harry's ward sense had woken him as cleanly as a hand on his shoulder. He pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. Quirrell stood in front of the Mirror of Arist. He'd already been through the traps, which had offered no meaningful resistance. Harry had re-enchanted several of them to be instructional rather than preventative, curious to observe how the man navigated them, and Quirrell had navigated them with the specific competence of a wizard being guided by a more powerful intelligence. The mirror stood between them and the stone, and Quirrell was staring into it with the particular desperation of a man who has been told the key is in the reflection, and cannot find what the reflection requires of him. The figure in the turban turned. Harry looked at him with the even, measuring attention of someone who has had months to prepare for this conversation. Quirrell's face was performing fear, habitual by now, but underneath it something else had surfaced. Something colder and more ancient, looking out through the defense professor's eyes with the quality of a predator that has just realized it walked into a room that was already occupied. "Quirrell," Harry said, "step away from the mirror." "The boy regent," said a voice that was not Quirrell's, from somewhere beneath the turban. Cold, without effect, with the specific absence of warmth that was its own form of intensity. How unexpectedly inconvenient. "I don't think so," Harry said. "I think this is exactly where tonight was always going." The turban moved. Quirrell's body turned slightly, and the voice beneath the fabric spoke again with the particular patience of something very old and very certain of its own intelligence. "You are 11 years old," it said. "You keep saying that," Harry said. "As if age is the variable that matters." He held his position at the doorway, relaxed in the way he'd learned over the past 4 months, the Gryffindor resonance open, measuring. Not hostile yet, but available. "You've been waiting in this building all year, waiting for the right moment, the right configuration, the right window. You've been patient." He paused. "I've been patient too." A silence. Then the voice, quieter, with the quality of something recalculating. "The conduit is gone." "Since August," Harry said. Another silence. The mirror behind Quirrell reflected the room, dark corridor, cold stone, 2 standing figures, and 1 flame of blue-white wandlight. In the reflection, Quirrell's turban glowed faintly with something that wasn't ambient light. "You burned it out," the voice said. Not a question. The calculation was audible in it. How, at what cost? What does this mean for the strategic position? Even now, even with the conduit severed, and the stone gone, and the mirror showing nothing useful, the intelligence behind the voice was still running the board. "Yes," Harry said. "Godric's line," the voice said. It sounded the way a physician sounds identifying a disease, precise, professional, emptied of surprise. "I underestimated the bloodline effect." A correctable error. Quirrell's hands came up slowly, not reaching for a wand but positioning, the body taking the posture of a man about to do something that requires full physical engagement. "I will not make it twice." "No," Harry agreed. "You won't." He let the fire come. Hermione had the Philosopher's Stone. She'd had it since October, recovered from behind the mirror using the Ravenclaw Grimoire's methodology for decoding reflective enchantment locks, which operated on desire inversion logic, and took her approximately 40 minutes to work out from first principles. She had replaced it with a simulacrum. The mirror still showed what it showed. And any sorcerer staring into it hoping for the real stone would always be looking at a very convincing reproduction sitting in the reflection. Harry had known this. He had let Quirrell spend 2 months trying to extract a stone that wasn't there, which served the dual purpose of giving them time to prepare and allowing Quirrell's possession situation to deteriorate to the point where the thing in his turban was making errors of impatience. Now Harry stood in front of the mirror with Quirrell between him and the door, and he said, "The stone isn't here. It hasn't been here since October. I suggest we discuss what you're going to do next." The cold voice from the turban did not speak again. What it did instead was worse. It reached, casting the full weight of Voldemort's fragmented, but still formidable, will toward Harry's mind in the specific attempt to find the emotional conduit it had always used. The conduit wasn't there. The scar was healed. The fragment was ash. What the reaching will found instead was the Gryffindor fire, waiting on the other side, and the fire was not afraid. Harry raised his right hand, palm out, and the fire came. It did not burn Quirrell in the theatrical sense. It burned the thing wearing Quirrell, precisely, surgically, targeting the foreign presence layered over the defense professor's own soul, with the same accuracy it had used on the Horcrux fragment. Quirrell's body registered the targeting and simply fell. The cold presence tore free, streaming upward like smoke, striking Harry's ward fabric and deflecting from it with a cry that was not audible so much as felt. And then it was gone. Through the ceiling, through the castle walls, outward into the December night, and the dark beyond it. Quirrell was unconscious on the floor. Harry stood there for a moment. Hermione was beside him, noting things on a small parchment. "He'll need hospital treatment," she said. "I'll get Dumbledore. The stone is in the Gryffindor vault at Gringotts," she said. "We should return it to Flamel in the spring. I'll write to him in January." Harry looked at the mirror, which was showing him nothing in particular, just the room, just himself and Hermione, standing in a dark corridor at 2 a.m. with a professor on the floor. He looked at the reflection for a moment. The boy in the glass looked like someone who had just finished something and was trying to decide what to start next. He turned away from the mirror and went to find Dumbledore. Snape initiated it. That was the fact Harry turned over in his mind on the way down to the dungeons. Snape had sent the note. Not to the headmaster's office, not to the General Regent's correspondence address. To Harry's personal suite, on a slip of parchment that bore no pleasantries and no preamble, just a time, a location, and come alone if you are willing. The matter is private. Harry came alone, which he suspected Hermione was not entirely pleased about, and which she had responded to with a 15-minute briefing on everything the grimoires and castle records contained about Severus Snape, delivered in the tone of someone who was not going to tell him what to do, but wanted to ensure he had complete information. He had complete information. He knocked on the office door. Snape opened it. They looked at each other. In the months since term began, this had been their dynamic, Snape maintaining the specific formal distance of a man performing normal professional behavior, while navigating a situation his entire life had not prepared him for. And Harry watching the performance with the patience of someone who knew exactly what it was covering. Snape stepped back. Harry entered the office. The room was what he'd expected. Sparse, purposeful, organized with the precision of a man who had learned that control of the visible environment was one of the few reliable controls available to him. Rows of labeled jars, student essays in neat stacks, a desk with nothing on it that wasn't being used, a single photograph, face down. Snape did not sit. He stood by the desk and looked at Harry with an expression that had clearly been composed in advance and was now discovering that composed expressions are harder to maintain than anticipated. "You have your mother's eyes," he said finally. "I know," Harry said. A pause. Something moved through Snape's face, beneath the composure. "You also have," he stopped. Started again. "The castle responds to you in a way I have not observed in 40 years of residence. The Gryffindor magic in the walls has changed since your arrival." "Yes, the headmaster is managing," Harry said. "We're not here to discuss the headmaster." He held Snape's gaze steadily. "I know what you are, Professor. I know what you've been doing since 1981. The grimoires contain intelligence-gathering methodology that my bloodline's magic has been applying to the castle's ambient record for the past several months." He paused to let that land. "I don't think you're a bad man. I think you've been operating without adequate protection for 11 years, under an arrangement that treats your safety as acceptable collateral damage against a larger objective." Snape was very still. "You are 11 years old. My bloodline is 900 years old," Harry said. "The age is a technicality." He reached into his robes and placed a sealed document on the desk. "That's a formal offer of shelter under the House of Gryffindor. What it means, specifically, your identity as an intelligence asset is protected under foundational sovereign immunity. No ministry body can compel your testimony. No Wizengamot proceeding can access your double-agent record without my explicit consent. If Voldemort returns and attempts to reclaim you, the Gryffindor wards extend to cover you physically." He let the silence settle. "In exchange, I'd like honest information, not allegiance, not loyalty performances, just honesty when I ask for it." Snape stared at the document. His jaw moved once. Harry waited. Snape picked up the document and read it. He read it the way he read student essays, not performatively but forensically, looking for errors or traps. He found none. "This is binding," Snape said. "Yes, under both foundational and goblin law. Gringotts holds the counter-signatory." Snape set the document down. He looked at Harry, and for the first time since Harry had entered the office, his face was doing something entirely unguarded. The expression of a man standing on ground he had not expected to find solid. "Dumbledore has never—" He stopped. Harry said nothing. He knew, from the grimoires and from 3 months of castle intelligence, exactly what Dumbledore had never done. He didn't say it, because there was a kind of cruelty in saying it directly that he wasn't willing to commit. Snape looked at the photograph, face down on the desk. Then he looked at Harry's eyes, and something in the calculation shifted into something else entirely. Not warmth, nothing so imprecise as that, but a recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has spent 11 years being used carefully and is now for the first time being handled with care. "You look like her," Snape said, very quietly. "But you think like him. The original. Not your father." "I know," Harry said. Snape picked up the document, turned it over, and signed it with his own wand tip, scoring his signature into the parchment in a thin line of silver light. The document sealed itself, both signet impressions flaring once, and then going still. He set it down. Then he sat, not at the desk but in the chair beside it, the one reserved, Harry realized, for conversations rather than transactions. He folded his hands. He looked at the opposite wall for a long moment, in the manner of someone organizing 11 years of accumulated information into a form that can be spoken aloud. Harry sat in the other chair and waited. Outside the dungeon windows, narrow stone framed, set high in the castle's foundation wall. The January dark had settled fully over the grounds. The lake was invisible beyond it. The torches in the corridor adjusted their light fractionally, the castle registering 2 people in a room where something important was about to be said. The ward fabric doing what it had always done. Bearing witness, keeping record, holding the substance of the moment in its old stone memory. Snape said, "What do you need to know?" Not a question. A door opening. Harry said, "Everything, starting with 1981. He settled back in the chair. "Take as long as you need." What followed was 3 hours long, and Harry did not interrupt it. Snape began with 1980, the recruitment, the initiation, the years of work that followed. He described them with the compressed precision of a man who has processed each memory into fact, stripping it of texture until only sequence remains. He described the night of the prophecy, the corridor outside the Hog's Head, the fragment he'd heard, the reporting of it, the moment he understood what he'd set in motion. Not immediately, gradually, the way a cold understanding settles rather than strikes, and the choice he'd made in the narrowing space before nothing could be changed. He described going to Dumbledore. He described what Dumbledore had said, and what the promise had and had not included. Then he stopped. "That is what happened," he said. "What happened after is that I have spent 11 years being a useful asset. The distinction between a person and an asset is something the headmaster has never found essential to articulate. He thought it was necessary," Harry said. "He thinks everything he does is necessary," Snape replied. "That is the specific quality that makes him both effective and dangerous. He is nearly always right about the necessity. He is consistently wrong about the cost." Harry looked at the photograph, face down on the desk. He didn't ask. He knew. "You're safe now," he said. "Whatever comes next, that part is handled." For the first time since Harry had entered the room, Severus Snape let the performance go entirely. Not warmth. Not relief. Just a man in a chair, in a room where something that had been wrong for a long time was being corrected, letting himself occupy the moment without defending it. Hermione had identified the diary in October. Not by accident, by systematic elimination. The Ravenclaw grimoire contained a comprehensive methodology for detecting Horcrux resonance within a building's ward field, developed by Rowena herself in response to a theoretical proposal by Salazar Slytherin that certain objects might be used to anchor a soul against death. Rowena's notation in the margin of that passage was characteristically blunt. theoretically viable. Ethically grotesque. Detection protocol follows on the off chance this is attempted by someone with no moral architecture. Hermione had run the detection sweep in September. The diary registered as a warm spike in the castle's southeast quadrant, moving, which meant someone was carrying it, which narrowed the field considerably. 3 weeks of observation identified the carrier as Ginny Weasley, first year, who had received the object as a gift and had no idea what it was. They'd recovered it from Ginny's dormitory. With Ginny's knowledge and a very careful conversation about what the diary was doing to her, which Hermione had conducted with a thoroughness and compassion that left Ginny Weasley both terrified and tremendously grateful, and then Harry had held it and let the Gryffindor fire make its assessment. The assessment was Horcrux. Significant Slytherin resonance imprint. Active intelligence preserved within. They had not destroyed it immediately, because the diary had a mouth, and mouths had information. They'd extracted what they needed, the location of the chamber, the basilisk, the structural enchantments of Slytherin's original ward work, and then Harry had gone down to deal with the source directly. The Chamber of Secrets was older than the school around it. Harry felt that immediately when he descended, the Parseltongue pipe wall was not Hogwarts magic. It was something prior, built by a different hand to a different purpose, and it sat inside the school's ward field the way a stone from a different building sits in a repaired wall, present, functional, but not quite harmonious with what surrounds it. He followed the passage down. The water on the floor was cold. The dark was absolute beyond his ring's light. Above and behind him he could hear, very faintly, the castle's ambient magic registering his passage, adjusting, the ward fabric parting to let him through. The chamber doors opened to his approach. Inside, the stone face of Salazar Slytherin at the far end, 40 feet high, its mouth sealed, the columns running to the serpent throne. And in the space between Harry and the throne, curled in loose coils that filled the width of the chamber, the basilisk. It was enormous. 60 feet of scale and muscle, ancient beyond any precise reckoning, sleeping in the way large things sleep, heavily, with the weight of a century's accumulated patience. Its eyes were closed. Harry stopped where he stood and extended the Gryffindor resonance outward, letting the chamber's magic read his bloodline the same way the castle above him had read it on his first day. The basilisk opened one eye. It turned toward him. And then, in the silence of a chamber that had not witnessed this in 1,000 years, it lowered its head. Not the specific lowering of a predator preparing to strike, the full, deliberate lowering of an enormous head to the stone floor, the neck following, the entire vast length of its body settling into stillness with a sound like a wave drawing back from a beach. An acknowledgement. A recognition that predated the school above them and the conflict that had split its founders. Older than the grudge, and outside of it entirely. Harry stood in the dark and breathed. Then he walked forward. Slowly, not because he was afraid. The basilisk had made its position clear, but because a creature that had been waiting in a sealed chamber for 1,000 years deserved the approach given to something that has earned patience. He stopped when he was close enough to see his own reflection in the great amber eye. Not the killing surface of it, the depth behind it, old, aware, tired in the specific way that very long confinement produces in a mind that was never designed for stillness. "I know," he said, in Parseltongue, not the language he'd learned, but the language he'd always known. The one that had surfaced through the Horcrux fragment and remained as residue after the purging fire, a tool without the wound. "I know how long you've been waiting." The basilisk exhaled. A long, slow release, the chamber shifting with the displaced air of it. The torchlight that Harry's ring cast bending around the movement. The great head stayed on the floor. The eye watched him with the unblinking attention of something that has decided to trust, after an interval long enough that trust has become its own kind of defiance. Harry crouched down so that his eyes were level with the floor, looking into that amber eye from below. "Slytherin put you here to protect something," Harry said. "That thing is gone. The purpose is discharged." He kept his voice even, the Parseltongue syllables coming naturally, unhurried. "You're not a weapon. You're not a secret. You're a 1,000-year-old creature who was locked in a room and told to wait. and the person who locked you here never came back." The basilisk was very still. Then, in the slow way of a mind not built for quick language, but capable of deep communication, came something in response, not words, but meaning that arrived in Harry's parcel-tongue sense like a current meeting ashore. A question. The oldest question. "What now?" "Now you come upstairs," Harry said. "When you're ready. The chamber will be yours properly, documented, protected, part of the school rather than hidden underneath it. The lake is right there." He indicated upward, through 1,000 feet of stone. "You can go in when it's dark. Nobody will bother you." The basilisk looked at him for a long moment. Then she exhaled, and in the exhale was something Harry recognized, not from Parseltongue but from the morning after day 5 of the Horcrux purge, when his scar had gone quiet for the first time. The specific quality of a thing releasing something it has been holding too long. "Relief. I'm not going to leave you here," Harry said. Harry burned the diary with Gryffindor fire, there in the chamber, standing before the basilisk that watched him with amber eyes that would not kill him, because it knew what he was. The diary screamed, the preserved intelligence within it. The echo of Tom Riddle at 16, tearing loose and dissolving with the quality of something that had expected victory, and received the specific shock of encountering something older than its own dark logic. The fire was precise. The leather cover charred and curled. The pages went white, then silver, then nothing. 11 seconds. Done. Harry looked at what remained, a thin layer of ash and a brass clasp, and felt the chamber's ambient magic shift. The Slytherin imprint in the wardwork, which had been running as a sustained countercurrent against the school's foundational harmony for 1,000 years, resolved suddenly into neutrality. Not destroyed. "Released, I'm going to reseal this chamber," he said to the basilisk, in the old language. Not as Slytherin sealed it, as the school requires it to be, accessible, documented, part of the building's history rather than its secret. He looked at the great serpent. "You won't be left here alone." He turned and walked to the chamber's central point and pressed both palms to the floor. The Gryffindor fire ran outward through the stone, following the lines of Slytherin's original enchantments, and adjusting them, not removing, integrating, stitching the chamber's wardwork back into the school's larger foundational field. Above him, in the castle, portraits stirred in their sleep. The enchanted ceiling of the great hall flickered once, briefly, like an eye opening. The Chamber of Secrets became, for the first time, a room with proper lighting, and a door that would answer to the school's master keys. Harry filed a memorandum with the Hogwarts administrative records designating it as Historical Chamber 1 Founder Slytherin, accessible to faculty with proper application. He noted, under the section marked Current Occupant, that the chamber housed a basilisk of approximately 1,000 years of age, presently cooperative and under foundational regency protection, not to be disturbed without prior authorization from the Lord Gryffindor. He climbed back out into the school and went to bed. The summons went out on a Monday. Harry had filed it Friday through the Gringotts Legal Courier. A formal foundational challenge, invoking the House of Gryffindor's constitutional standing to demand a full Wizengamot hearing on the continued detention of Sirius Orion Black, held in Azkaban since November 1981, without trial, without formal charge, without any record of either a Wizengamot proceeding or an admission under oath of the crimes for which he was imprisoned. The ministry's response had been to suggest the matter could be addressed in due course, through proper channels. Harry's response to that response had been a second filing, invoking the emergency review clause of the 1707 Ministry Founding Charter, which required that any constitutional challenge filed by a foundational seat holder be heard within 5 business days without exception. The ministry's response to that had been to constitute a full Wizengamot panel on the morning of the following Monday, which was today. Harry sat in the foundational seat, a chair that had apparently always been there at the chamber's center, dusty with disuse, and currently being occupied for the first time since the ministry's founding. Hermione sat to his left with 12 folders of documented evidence. Snape, who had produced a signed testimony from memory with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting to tell this particular truth for 11 years, sat 3 rows back with the bearing of someone experiencing an unusual emotion who had not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. Cornelius Fudge, green bowler hat, hands arranged to project unruffled confidence, succeeding only partially, sat at the presiding magistrate's seat and looked at Harry the way a man looks at weather he cannot control. "The petition," Harry said, "is straightforward. Sirius Black was imprisoned without trial. That is not in dispute. There is no trial record. It is also not legally defensible under any version of British magical law, prior to or post the Ministry's founding. We are asking for a formal hearing in which he is charged, evidence is presented, and a verdict is rendered by this body." He paused. "We are also asking that a trained veritaserum administration be conducted in the presence of this panel. Given that the key factual questions at issue, whether Sirius Black was the Potter's secret keeper, whether he betrayed them, and who actually transmitted the location to Lord Voldemort, can be resolved definitively by 20 minutes and 2 drops. Fudge cleared his throat. The Ministry's position is not a constitutional argument," Harry said. "It is an administrative preference. This chamber is not bound by Ministry administrative preferences. It is bound by the founding law of magical Britain, which predates the Ministry by 7 centuries. He placed the Gryffindor signet ring on the table in front of him, and waited. Sirius Black was exonerated by 2:17 p.m. on the same day. The veritaserum testimony had taken 19 minutes. Pettigrew's name, the secret keeper arrangement, the 12 muggles, the staged death, 12 years in hiding, all of it coming out under the serum's absolute compulsion while the Wizengamot panel listened and Fudge's expression moved through 7 distinct phases of political reckoning. Pettigrew himself was in custody by end of day. Located through a combination of Hermione's tracking methodology and a discreet communication to Arthur Weasley that sent him to check his garden shed. Harry had one more piece of business before the hearing concluded. "The Dementors at Hogwarts," he said, from the foundational seat, after the black verdict was recorded. "I am formally declaring Hogwarts and all its sovereign grounds a Dementor-free territory, effective immediately, under the Emergency Protection Clause of the Founders' Charter, which permits the regents to exclude from the sovereign estate any entity whose nature is incompatible with the physical and psychological well-being of the estate's students." He looked at Fudge. "I am also filing a constitutional challenge to the continued use of Dementors as prison guards at Azkaban, on grounds that their employment constitutes ongoing psychological torture of the incarcerated, which is prohibited under the Magical Welfare Accords of 1843, which this body ratified." Fudge said, carefully, "That challenge would require extensive deliberation, yes," Harry said. "Schedule it for the spring term. In the meantime, the Dementors leave Hogwarts grounds by Friday, or I will remove them myself, and I would prefer not to do that because I suspect it will be unpleasant for everyone involved." The Dementors left Hogwarts by Thursday. Sirius Black walked out of the Ministry's temporary holding facility on a Friday afternoon in late October. Wearing robes Harry had sent via Owl 3 days earlier, because the ones Sirius had been wearing when they transferred him from Azkaban were not worth examining closely. He walked out with the particular gait of a man who has not trusted the ground under his feet in 12 years, and is still testing it. Harry was waiting outside. Sirius stopped when he saw him. They stood there in the pale autumn sunlight, on a street in London, and looked at each other, a man who had last seen this face on the night his best friends died, and a boy who had no memory of the man, but had spent 2 months reading Gringotts records and Castle intelligence files and Snape's grudging testimony, and assembled from those sources a detailed portrait of who Sirius Black actually was, underneath what 12 years in Azkaban had done to him. "You're tall," Sirius said. His voice was rough. James was tall. Lily was short. You split the difference. "I've been told," Harry said. A pause. The street moved around them, Muggle London, indifferent. Pigeons and taxis and a man selling newspapers at the corner. Sirius looked at Harry the way a person looks at something they'd believed was gone, and haven't yet fully accepted as present. "I was afraid it would be too late," Sirius said. His voice was doing something careful. "I thought, 12 years, and whatever Dumbledore had planned, it wasn't too late," Harry said. He took a step forward, and then another, and Sirius met him halfway with the instinct of someone who has been waiting a very long time to do this specific thing, and the hug lasted approximately 15 seconds, which was enough. They walked to the apparition point together. Harry told Sirius, concisely and without softening it, the broad outline of what had happened since August 1991. Sirius listened the way a man listens when he is trying to simultaneously absorb information and recalibrate his entire understanding of his own situation, which produced an expression of remarkable complexity. "You fired Lucius Malfoy from the board," Sirius said, "in September. You dissolved the board entirely." "Restructured," Harry said. "The institution stayed. Just the executive overreach was removed." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "Then, your father would have found this absolutely extraordinary." He considered. "Your mother would have already drafted the follow-up legislation." Harry looked at him. "I know," he said. And he meant it, the Evans' eyes looking out at the man who had loved both of them, and who was still here, and who was going to be all right. Sirius took a room in the East Wing 2 days later. The Founder's Suite had more bedrooms than Harry and Hermione used, and the castle accepted him with the specific warmth it extended to people connected by blood or bond to the Gryffindor line. He spent the first week relearning how to occupy space that wasn't trying to shrink him, opening windows and leaving them open. Sitting on the balcony for long stretches, watching the lake with an expression that had not yet settled into anything as simple as peace but was moving, deliberately, in that direction. The first time he laughed was over breakfast, when Harry showed him Hermione's rejection letter to Lockhart. It was not a loud laugh, just the specific surprise of a body remembering a reflex it thought it had lost. Harry noted it without comment and passed the marmalade. That evening Sirius said, from the balcony, James would have been so proud. Lily more than James, actually. She'd have approved of the methodology. They sat in the autumn dark, and the castle held them both. And in its old stone warmth something that had been broken for 12 years was, slowly and not without cost, beginning to mend. Fudge tried 5 times to neutralize the situation before Harry made the formal move. The first attempt was bureaucratic, a ministry working group on Hogwarts administrative anomalies, which produced a 12-page report suggesting that the Founders' Charter's legal standing was ambiguous and might require a full Wisingamot review before further actions could be taken on its authority. Harry read the report, annotated it with 47 citations from the grimoires, and returned it with a cover letter suggesting the working group had relied on sources written after the charter they were attempting to supersede, which was an error analogous to using a child's testimony to question the validity of the parent's will. The second attempt was social. Dumbledore, at Fudge's request, visited the Founders' Suite for a long and careful conversation, in which he proposed a partnership framework between the Regency and the Ministry that would allow the current administrative structure to continue functioning while the broader constitutional questions were developed over time. Harry listened to the proposal with full attention, thanked Dumbledore for his time, and said he'd consider it. Hermione, who had been present and taking notes, sent a formal reply the following morning declining with 12 specific references to which sections of the Founders' Charter the partnership framework would have violated. The third, fourth, and fifth attempts were variants on the above. Fudge appeared to believe that the situation could be managed through delay, that delay would eventually produce some combination of Harry losing interest, the Wisingamot proxy votes being quietly purchased, or the legal arguments developing a crack large enough to exploit. The crack did not develop. The Wisingamot proxy votes could not be purchased because they were blood oaths, which could not be transferred by financial transaction. And Harry did not lose interest. The work of those months was not dramatic. That was the thing nobody outside the Founders' Suite saw clearly. How much of it was just reading? Cross-referencing. The slow accumulation of a position so thoroughly documented that no challenge could find purchase on it. Hermione had been building the constitutional case since October. The diadem circlet had fully resonated by January, the architectural clarity the grimoire described arriving not as a sudden change but as a progressive sharpening, the way a lens comes into focus, until the structural logic of 8 centuries of magical law was as legible to her as first-year textbooks had been on the Hogwarts Express. She worked from the Ravenclaw grimoire outward, constructing arguments in layered precedent the way one builds a load-bearing wall, foundation first, everything else placed precisely on top of it. Harry's contribution was different. He read the same documents, but what the Gryffindor resonance brought him was not architectural comprehension. It was the specific intelligence of a bloodline that had been doing this for 9 centuries, the intuition of which arguments would hold under pressure, and which ones looked solid but would splinter. He caught 3 places where Hermione's framework was technically correct, but strategically exposed. She caught 2 places where his instinct was right but insufficiently documented to survive a formal challenge. By March, they had something neither of them could have built alone. On March 28, 1994, Harry filed a constitutional document at Gringotts, the Wizengamot clerk's office, and the office of every magical newspaper in Britain simultaneously. It was titled, Emergency Act Invocation, Founders Charter, Section 19, Paragraph 1, Dissolution of Executive Bodies Acting Against the Foundational Interest of the Magical Population. Section 19 had been written by all 4 founders. Its preamble stated, in the Old Tongue, which Hermione had translated with the Diadem's assistance into modern English for the filing, in the event that the governing bodies of the magical realm operate to the active detriment of the population they are constituted to serve, the regents of the founding houses hold authority to dissolve those bodies and constitute replacements, without requirement of approval from the bodies being dissolved. Fudge received his copy at 9 in the morning. By midday, every copy of every magical newspaper in Britain had the document on its front page. The dissolution of Fudge's ministry was not a coup. This was the specific point Harry made at the emergency Wizengamot session convened 3 days later. Attended by every member who could reach London in time, standing room only in the Chamber's public gallery, a moment that Wizarding Britain would refer to for decades afterward as simply the session. We are not taking power, Harry said from the foundational seat, with Hermione to his left and the Gryffindor and Ravenclaw signet rings on both their hands glowing with the cold, clean luminosity of something that has been waiting to be said for a very long time. We are returning it to where it belongs, which is here, in this chamber, with this body, exercising its authority without external interference from a ministry whose executive branch has, over the past 3 years, demonstrated a consistent pattern of prioritizing political self-preservation over the welfare of the magical population it exists to serve. He placed a document on the table. Not the dissolution notice. Something Hermione had drafted over the preceding 4 weeks with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered. That is a proposed restructuring charter for the Ministry of Magic, Harry said. The Department for Magical Law Enforcement remains unchanged. The Department of Magical Creatures receives an independent supervisory board. The executive function, the minister's office, is reconstituted as a position of Wizengamot appointment and review rather than popular election, on a 3-year renewable term, with full financial disclosure required from the minister and the 2 most senior undersecretaries. He looked around the chamber. We are not the government. We are the landlords of the institution the government operates from, and we are returning the house to its proper structure. A pause. Cornelius Fudge's term as minister ends today. The Wizengamot will appoint an interim government within 30 days. Candidates are listed in Appendix C. The session lasted 4 hours. 3 senior Wizengamot members challenged the constitutional standing of the foundational seat, on grounds that no formal legal precedent within the last 5 centuries recognized its authority. Harry produced the Gringotts Certified Founders Charter in its original magical format, which remained legally sealed in a way that could only be broken by a foundational heir, and therefore constituted the most reliable possible verification of its own authenticity. The 3 challenges collapsed. A 4th member, elderly, from a family that had held its Wizengamot seat for 4 centuries, rose and said, very carefully, Lord Gryffindor, what assurance do we have that this is not simply a power transfer from one unaccountable executive to another? The chamber went quiet. Harry looked at him. He appreciated the question. He had in fact prepared for it, because it was the right question, the one that distinguished between a correction and a replacement of the same problem. The charter I've placed before you, Harry said, contains no provision for regent veto over Wizengamot votes. No provision for regent appointment of ministry officials. No provision for regent override of a properly constituted legislative majority. He paused. What it does contain is a provision for regent dissolution of executive bodies that exceed their mandate. The dissolving authority and the governing authority are different. We are exercising the first. We are not claiming the second, The elderly member sat down with the expression of someone who has received an adequate answer to an important question and is filing it for future reference. Dumbledore spoke once, near the end. He rose from the observers section. He had no voting position here, having always been careful to separate his Hogwarts authority from the Wizengamotes, and said, in the tone of a man choosing his words with maximum precision, I believe the record should reflect that the current headmaster of Hogwarts offers his full institutional support to the transitional process and requests only that the school's academic functions remain undisturbed through the legislative period. Harry looked at him across the chamber. The school's academic functions have always been undisturbed, he said. That's what we've been managing for. He held the old man's gaze for a moment. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the acknowledgement of a shared interest in the same outcome arrived at from very different starting points. Thank you, Professor, at the end of it. Cornelius Fudge collected his green bowler hat from the minister's office and took the flu home, and the Wizengamot spent the next 23 days in the most intense legislative session magical Britain had seen in 2 centuries. And when it ended, it had a new structural charter and an interim government, and a significant number of things that worked significantly better than they had before. Harry and Hermione went back to school. The delegation arrived in October, 2 weeks after term began. Beauxbatons came first, an azure carriage the size of a house, descending from the northern sky in a broad circle that gave the school's wards time to register it as non-hostile. Madame Maxime descended the steps with the bearing of a woman who expected to be received as a peer, and was quietly checking whether that expectation would be met. She was met by Harry and Hermione at the main gates, which were open, not thrown open in formal pageantry, just open, the way a household's front door is open when it's expecting company. Harry shook her hand. Hermione said something to her in French. Maxime's expression shifted from diplomatic composure to genuine warmth. Durmstrang arrived by ship on a Thursday evening, rising from the lake with a slow drama that the squid regarded with enormous interest. Igor Karkaroff came up the gangplank with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a handshake calibrated to project more confidence than he felt. Harry shook it, read the man immediately, and noted the dark mark residue in Karkaroff's aura, with the specific diagnostic clarity the Gryffindor fire brought to everything that carried Slytherin imprint magic. He filed it under monitor, and moved on. The Triwizard Tournament's formal opening ceremony was held in the Great Hall on the last evening of October. The goblet of fire was brought out, blue-white flame in an ancient stone cup, and Dumbledore explained the submission process to the assembled students of 3 schools, while Harry and Hermione sat at the high table and waited. The host school's sovereigns are entered as a joint submission, Hermione said quietly to Dumbledore after the ceremony, while students filtered out. She produced a document. It's in the original tournament charter. When the host is a foundational institution with active regents, the regents are the host school's representative. It was never written out of the rules, just became moot for 700 years when no regents existed. Dumbledore read the document. He had, by this point, developed a sophisticated response to documents produced by Hermione, complete attention, very thorough reading, and a composed acceptance that something well-researched would be well-founded. Very well, he said. The first task was the dragons. 4 of them, a Chinese fireball, a Hungarian horntail, a Swedish short snout, and a common Welsh green, secured in a quarried enclosure behind the castle, each guarding a golden egg. Harry and Hermione went last, entered as a joint submission, which the tournament interpreted as a single performance in the arena. The horntail was Harry's. He walked into the enclosure and stood at the far end while the dragon, chained at the central stake, 60 feet of black scale and yellow eye and the specific bad temper of a large animal that has been confined against its will, oriented toward him with all the focused attention of something that has identified a target. Harry opened his Gryffindor resonance outward, not as a weapon, as an introduction. The horntail stopped, its nostrils flared, scenting something it hadn't expected. Its yellow eyes processed Harry with the slow deliberateness of an ancient animal recalibrating. The chain went slack, not because Harry had freed it, but because the dragon had simply stopped pulling against it. Harry walked forward. The crowd in the stands had gone completely silent. He stopped 10 feet from the horntail's head, which was now 3 feet from the ground, still enormous. Still capable of ending the situation in a second, but inclined downward with the specific quality of acknowledgement he had seen once before, in the chamber, from a creature that recognized something older than the current arrangement. "I need the egg," Harry said quietly. The horntail looked at him. Then it stepped to the side. The golden egg sat on its nest. Harry walked past the dragon's shoulder, picked it up, and walked back to the judge's table. The crowd noise, when it returned, was extraordinary. Hermione's portion of the task had been the egg's puzzle, solved in the enclosure in 6 minutes, without entering the water, using an acoustic resonance technique from the Ravenclaw grimoire that interpreted the Murmish song through its mathematical structure rather than its linguistic content. The judges gave them combined marks of 12, the maximum possible, which was unprecedented in the tournament's history and prompted 3 separate rules consultations from Karkaroff, who maintained throughout all 3 that the scoring methodology was unclear. The second task was the lake. When Harry walked to its edge on the morning of February 24th, he already knew who the hostages were. Because Hermione had determined this the previous week through an analysis of the tournament administrator's logistical patterns, she was one of them. She had declined to be particularly troubled by this on grounds that she trusted Harry's preparation entirely, and found the emotional manipulation component of the task reductive. Harry looked at the lake. The lake looked back at him, deep and cold, and entirely indifferent to competitive timelines. He extended the Gryffindor resonance outward, not toward the surface but into it, through it, the same reaching out he used on the castle's wards applied to a body of water that had been sitting on Hogwarts grounds for 9 centuries and had absorbed enough ambient foundational magic to register his bloodline like a bell registering its own tone. The lake answered. Not quickly, and not with anything so dramatic as the water parting. What happened was quieter. The giant squid surfaced 50 feet from the bank, regarded Harry with one enormous yellow eye for approximately 3 seconds, and then, with the unhurried cooperation of a creature that had been asked politely, descended again. In its wake, the water along the central channel to the deep cavern where the hostages were held became navigable, the currents adjusting, the visibility clearing. Harry was back on the bank with all 4 hostages in 22 minutes. The judges had to invent a new scoring category. The third task was the maze, and the maze attempted to be personal. The tournament had enchanted the hedges to respond to the champion's fears, an ambient dark magic that drew from the psychological landscape of whoever entered and generated challenges specific to them. Against Victor Krum it produced physical obstacles and a boggart shaped like failure. Against Fleur it produced misdirection and sound illusions. Against Cedric it produced escalating legal ethical dilemmas rendered in near hallucinatory detail. Against Harry and Hermione it produced nothing for 40 seconds, the maze's dark magic reaching into them, finding the fears it expected to find, and instead encountering a foundational ward field that was 900 years old and deeply unimpressed. Then it produced a corridor and stepped aside. That was anticlimactic, Hermione said as they walked. Yes, Harry agreed. We could have found the center faster. I was mapping as we went. I know. I thought it was polite to let the maze feel like it was trying. Hermione looked at him. The expression was the one that meant tolerable. Occasionally, at the scoring table, Harry looked across at Victor Krum, Fleur Delacour, and Cedric Diggory. 3 competitors who had performed admirably under genuinely difficult conditions, each with different strategies, each of whom had earned their marks by the work. He made a point of speaking to each of them that evening. Krum, who spoke careful English with the reserve of someone used to being observed for his skill rather than talked to as a person, received the conversation with visible surprise and something that might eventually become gratitude. Fleur, who had been braced for condescension from everyone and had received it from most quarters, got a conversation conducted in her own language by Hermione, which produced in her a considerable recalibration of expectations. Cedric received an acknowledgement that he was the most technically precise wandcaster of the 4 of them, which was both accurate and the specific compliment he most needed to hear. The tournament concluded, but the shape of it had shifted, away from competition, toward demonstration. Harry and Hermione were not competing for a prize. They were hosting a performance, and the performance was a proof of concept, Magic could look like this. Magic, at its best, looked exactly like this. They had known about the graveyard since March. Snape's intelligence network, running at full capacity since the beginning of the year with the protection of Gryffindor's sovereign immunity covering him absolutely, had tracked the reconstruction of Voldemort's physical form through Pettigrew's activities with the methodical clarity that competent intelligence produces when it isn't being ignored by the people receiving it. Pettigrew had gone to ground in Eastern Europe in early January, then Albania in February, then England in April, and his magical signature, identified through the Gringotts tracking registry that Hermione had requisitioned access to in the fall, had been moving steadily toward Little Hangleton all spring. Harry and Hermione had filed the intelligence with Snape's countersigned testimony and sent it to the 3 senior Aurors whose appointment to a newly constituted security advisory they'd arranged through the ministry restructuring. The advisory had prepared a response protocol. They were at the graveyard anyway, because some things are not delegated. The ritual completed before they arrived. The cauldron. The bone and flesh and blood. The old dark magic working exactly as it had been designed to work. And the figure that rose from it was what Tom Riddle had spent 60 years constructing, a physical form rebuilt from borrowed and stolen materials, carrying all the magical force of a wizard who had fractured his soul 7 times in pursuit of something he called immortality and was, actually, terror. Voldemort stood in the graveyard and looked at the 2 figures who stood at its entrance, and the snake-like face processed them with a precise and ancient malice. "The heir of Gryffindor," he said. His voice was exactly as the grimoire's account of prior encounters had described, cold, clear, with the specific quality of absolute conviction in its own superiority. "And the Ravenclaw girl. How thorough." He looked at Harry. "I expected to find you here." "I did not expect to find you like this." "I know," Harry said. "That's the point." Voldemort raised his wand. The Death Eaters assembled in a circle around the graveyard raised theirs. Harry raised his hand, palm out, and the Gryffindor fire came, broader than anything he'd used before. A wall of light not quite orange or gold, the specific color of very old fire that has learned to be precise. It took the Death Eaters' curses and redirected them into the earth, with the indifference of something that was not blocking so much as categorizing incoming magic and reassigning it elsewhere. Voldemort watched this. His expression did not change, but his magical output shifted, reaching, probing, looking for the seams in Harry's defenses with the tactical acuity of a wizard who had been very good at this for a very long time. He did not find the seams. Because Harry did not have seams. He had a foundation. Voldemort stopped probing. The snake face processed this with the same cold intelligence it applied to everything. And then it did something Harry had not anticipated. It spoke to him. Not in English. In Parseltongue. "You are of the line that opposed us," it said, with the specific weight of us that meant Salazar and I, Slytherin's ideology, and the man who had claimed it as inheritance. "You burned my anchor from your blood. You recovered the school. You have removed my weapons one by one." A pause. The Death Eaters held their positions, some of them no longer meeting Harry's eyes. "You have done all of this in 4 years." Harry answered in the same language, because the residue was still there, the passive sensitivity, the Parseltongue without the conduit. "Yes. Why are you here?" Voldemort asked. And for the first time, in the question, something appeared in the cold voice that was not calculation and not malice. It was simpler than either. It was the question a man asks when the thing he was most afraid of turns out not to look the way he expected. "Because you're still here," Harry said. "And I promised the magical world that it would be safe." Voldemort raised his wand one final time, not in hope, but because it was the only motion left available to him. The gesture of a man who has nothing else to do with his hands. The curse he threw was the killing one, green and absolute, crossing the graveyard with all the force of a wizard who had spent 60 years refining his singular gift. Harry did not step aside. He did not raise a shield. He opened the Gryffindor fire fully. The fire was not a counter-curse. It was a state of being, a quality of magical presence that filled the graveyard the way light fills a room, not targeted but total, and when the killing curse struck it, It did what killing curses had always done in the presence of Gryffindor's specific magic. It met something it could not categorize. Something built not on fear of death, but on the active, structural refusal of it. And it failed. The graveyard went white. Then it went quiet. The Horcruxes were already gone. This was the fact Voldemort had not yet understood. Standing in the graveyard with his newly rebuilt body and his assembled Death Eaters, reaching for the immortality anchors that his split soul should have been able to feel, and not finding them. Harry and Hermione had spent 18 months on the Horcrux hunt, the grimoire's detection methodology, the diadem's cognition enhancement, Snape's intelligence, Hermione's organizational precision, 4 of the 7 destroyed by December of 1994. The remaining 2 by May of 1995. The process had been systematic and entirely without drama, because the point of the process was to eliminate drama. What remained, standing in the little Hangleton graveyard, was a man. Not even a particularly powerful one. Voldemort without his Horcrux network was what he had always been underneath. Tom Riddle, 68 years old, brilliant and terrible and entirely mortal, standing in a borrowed body that was already arguing with the soul it had been given. Harry looked at him with the specific quality of attention that comes from knowing exactly what something is. "I'm not going to kill you," Harry said. Voldemort's expression, which had been performing contempt, shifted. "What I'm going to do," Harry continued, "is exercise the Lord Gryffindor's founding authority over the magical laws of this estate, and formally strip you of your claimed identity." He raised his right hand. The ring was burning gold in the dark. "Tom Marvolo Riddle, you were born December 31st, 1926, at St. Brutus's Hospital, London. You have no Slytherin blood beyond 4 generations of deliberate genealogical forgery. Your magical education occurred at Hogwarts, in rooms built by the people whose authority you have been claiming as your own for 60 years. The fire extended from Harry's hand, not as a weapon but as a structure. An architectural construct that shaped itself around Voldemort's magical signature and began to pull. This is what your Lord of Gryffindor does to what you have made yourself." What happened next was not quick. It was not theatrical. The fire moved the way surgery moves, with intent, without anger, finding the specific lines of what had been built, and unwinding them from the inside out. The Death Eaters at the graveyard's perimeter could see it happening, something in their master's posture changing, not breaking but deflating, the terrible upright certainty going out of him the way air goes out of a vessel that has been punctured in exactly the right place. Some of them stepped back, not in resistance. In the involuntary recoil of people who have spent years orienting toward a source of power and are watching that source go dark. Voldemort did not scream. That was the thing Harry would remember afterward. The silence of it. The absence of dramatic final pronouncements. Just a man standing in a graveyard watching the name he had chosen fall away from him in fragments. The constructed identity dissolving under the weight of the foundation it had always been built on, which was nothing. Fear, dressed up as destiny. Ambition, dressed up as bloodline. Tom Riddle, standing in the ruin of everything he had made of himself, looking at Harry across the Yorkshire dark, and understanding in the final moment that the thing which had unmade him was not power, or superiority, or any of the currencies he'd spent 60 years acquiring. It was simply an 11-year-old boy in a Gringotts vault, on a warm August morning, who had said yes without thinking about what it meant, and had meant it completely. The body rebuilt from bone and blood and the borrowed life of a servant began to process the actual age of the soul inside it, and Tom Riddle was very old. And the body reflected that, and when it was over there, was an old man on the grass of a Yorkshire graveyard, who was entirely human, and entirely powerless, and entirely ordinary in the specific way that terrible things become ordinary when their power is taken from them. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the Death Eaters. "The Aurors are outside the graveyard's perimeter ward. I suggest everyone make their own choices now." 12 of the 17 surrendered. The other 5 ran, and the Aurors caught 4 of them by morning. Harry walked out of the graveyard. Hermione fell into step beside him. The night air smelled like grass and turned earth and the faint metallic trace of old magic discharging, and overhead the stars were very bright in the midsummer dark. And neither of them said anything for a while. Eventually, Hermione said, "The Aurors will want a debrief." "In the morning," Harry said. They walked in silence a while longer. "Do you feel different?" Hermione asked. Harry thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered. The scar on his forehead was cool. The Gryffindor fire was banked low in his blood, present but not pressing, the way a fire goes when the work is done, and the night is quiet, and there's nothing left to burn. "Yes," he said. "I think so." They walked home. The world did not change all at once. This was something Harry had understood since August, since the morning after the Gringotts ritual, when he'd sat with a grimoire in the castle's library and read for 6 hours straight, and begun to develop a sense of the scale of what had been waiting. Not just for him. In the structural conditions of the wizarding world, the inequities and inefficiencies that had been calcifying for 3 centuries while the people with the authority to address them had been absent. The world did not change all at once. But it changed. The Muggle-born integration project was Hermione's. She'd been developing it since year 2, working from the Ravenclaw grimoire's foundational principle that magical ability distributed itself according to no deterministic genetic law, and that any system treating it otherwise was wasting its greatest resource. The initiative, formally titled the Granger Initiative for Magical Equity in Education at Harry's insistence, because Hermione had named it something much more modest, created a systematic process for identifying magical children regardless of parentage, providing early support to Muggle-born families, and restructuring the Hogwarts admissions process to address the social disadvantage that arrived with the letter. It passed the Wizengamot in spring 1996 with the specific combination of foundational authority and pragmatic incentive that had become the Regency's legislative signature. 43 votes in favor. 7 against. Lucius Malfoy, who no longer held a Wizengamot seat, commented on it from outside the chamber to a journalist who quoted him at length, under the headline "Former Board Member, criticizes what he cannot change." The Azkaban challenge was Harry's, and it took longer. The Dementor question was constitutionally complex. Not because the argument was unclear, but because responding to it required an alternative, and building an alternative required the creation of a magical corrections system that had never previously existed. Harry and Hermione spent most of 1996 on its architecture, drawing on Muggle penological research that Hermione had sourced through her parents and cross-referenced against wizarding magical containment methodology. The resulting system, physical magical suppression rather than psychological destruction, with formal sentencing procedures and review timelines, was operational by 1997. The last Dementors left Azkaban in March. The international reach was not something either of them had planned. What happened was, the news traveled, as news does, and the wizarding schools of other nations had been watching the British situation with the specific attention of institutions that have their own structural problems and have been waiting for proof of concept. Beauxbatons contacted them first, then Ilvermorny, then 3 schools whose names do not appear in the standard British wizarding reference materials because they have preferred, for centuries, not to be known to British wizarding reference materials. Harry and Hermione invited them to Hogwarts for a summit in August 1997. 12 schools attended. 8 more sent observers. The agenda was not British wizarding governance. The agenda was the question of what magical education was for, what it owed its students, how it interacted with the non-magical world, whether the systems of the past 3 centuries were the best available, or merely the ones that had calcified in the absence of people with both the authority and the vision to replace them. The summit lasted 2 weeks and produced 37 recommendations. 29 were implemented somewhere within the following 3 years. Harry did not feel powerful during the summit. He felt useful, which was better. The day before the new founding charter was to be signed, Harry sat alone on the balcony of the founder's suite and watched the lake in the late afternoon light. The mountains to the west were going amber. A pair of thestrals moved through the far tree line with the patient grace of animals that have been present for every significant event in this building's history, and will be present for several hundred more. Dumbledore came to find him. Harry heard the old wizard's footsteps on the stone corridor and felt the castle register them. Recognized. Familiar. No threat. And waited. Dumbledore settled into the second chair with the ease of a very old man sitting down in the presence of a young person, whose respect he hasn't had to earn so much as demonstrate he deserves. "You've done extraordinary things," Dumbledore said. "We've done them," Harry said. "Hermione more than me, on most of the structural work." A pause. The lake moved in the wind, silver dark. "I owe you an accounting," Dumbledore said, "of the years before, of what I knew and what I kept, and what I planned." "I know," Harry said. "I'd like to have that conversation. But not today." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not angry." "I'm not angry," Harry said carefully. "But what I'm doing with the anger is more interesting than what I'd be doing if I just sat in it." He looked at the old man, at the face that had been in charge of his future for 11 years without asking him, and had done it from love and certainty and an enormous, careful blindness to the possibility that the future being managed might have preferred to manage itself. "I think you believed it was the only way." "I did," Dumbledore said. "I think you were wrong." "I think so too," Dumbledore said, very quietly. Now, they sat in the evening light for a while, the two of them, and the castle held them both in its old, patient warmth, and the lake moved, and the mountains went slowly from amber to purple to dark. The new founding charter was signed at sunrise on September 1st, 1997, in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, before an assembly of 700 witches and wizards from 14 countries, with 4 Gringotts witnesses and the enchanted ceiling throwing early morning light across a hall that had seen every significant moment in its school's history, and understood, in whatever way old buildings understand things, that this one was among the most significant of all. Harry and Hermione signed it last. The document ran to 63 pages. It established the Founders' Compact of Modern Magic, a framework of principles for wizarding governance, education, and the relationship between magical and non-magical society, meant not as legislation but as something pre-legislative, the values from which legislation should derive. Article 1 established that magical ability is not owned by any bloodline, nation, or tradition, and that the institutions of magic exist to develop it in every person in whom it appears, regardless of parentage, location, or the circumstances of their birth. Article 2 established that the people wielding authority in magical society are its servants, not its masters, and that authority is granted by those it serves, and returned when those who hold it fail that obligation. Article 3, the one Harry had written himself, in 2 drafts and then a third, trying to find the most honest version of the thing he actually meant, said this: "The children who come after us are not ours to protect. They are theirs to live. Our obligation is to leave them better conditions than we found, and then step back." He signed his name under that article and set down the quill. Hermione signed beside him. The charter sealed itself with both signet rings, gold and silver light running through the parchment in spiraling lines that were also, very faintly, the outlines of a lion and an eagle, just visible if you looked at exactly the right angle. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then Neville Longbottom, in the 3rd row, started clapping. The sound spread outward through the room in the way sound spreads when it has been waiting to happen. Not a single eruption, but an accumulation, building through the crowd from person to person. The students and teachers and international representatives and Gringotts delegates and 3 nervous journalists from the Prophet, and 1 from an international paper, all of them finding themselves on their feet, without quite deciding to stand. Harry looked at Hermione. She had tears in her eyes, which she would later deny if asked directly, and which Harry noted without comment as a piece of information he would keep permanently and privately. "Now what?" he said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Now we go to class," she said. "We're still enrolled." He laughed. It was an honest laugh, not performed, not managed, just a thing that rose out of the exact right place in the chest and came out unchecked. Hermione looked at him with the expression she had been developing over 6 years of their acquaintance, the one that meant, "You are occasionally tolerable." They had 7 months left of school. They went. The years that followed were not perfect. No structure built by humans is. The Granger Initiative met resistance in 3 countries and had to be substantially revised for 2 more. The Azkaban replacement system required 2 significant amendments in its first year of operation. The International Compact was observed faithfully by 9 of the original 14 signatories and was the subject of ongoing friction with 4 of the other 5, who had their own traditions and their own authority and their own entirely valid objections to certain provisions. Harry and Hermione addressed each problem as it came, with the same tools they'd always used: preparation, directness, the cold patience of people who understood that most problems are structural, and most structural problems yield to sustained and methodical attention. They taught at Hogwarts for 2 years after their own graduation, and then Harry became the first Lord Gryffindor in 9 centuries to formally disperse the Lord's direct governance authority, not abandoning it, but translating it into the Compact's framework, so that the principles of the foundational seat were built into the new system's bones, rather than residing in any one person's ring. The ring went into the Gryffindor vault at Gringotts, in the room where it had waited for 1,000 years, in the dark that had held it patiently across the full span of history between the man who first wore it and the boy who came to claim it in August of 1991. It was there if it was needed. Harry thought it probably wouldn't be. The world, imperfect and ongoing and still beautifully unfinished, carried forward. The magical children came. They grew. They learned. They became, each of them, something that no one had planned. The specific irreducible surprise of a new person, arriving in a world that had been left slightly better than it had been found. The mountains held the castle. The castle held its students. The enchanted ceiling moved through its seasons, and the staircases stepped willingly, and the portraits in their frames noted each passing year with the patient satisfaction of witnesses who have seen many things and know the good ones when they occur. In the Founder's Suite, the light still burned, amber and ordinary and warm, and the grimoires on the shelves held everything that had been learned, and outside the balcony the lake went through its morning colors, silver into gold into blue, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be, moving without effort in the way very old things move, as if they have always known exactly where they're going. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.